Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our witnesses. Today we are discussing the recent rapid rise of home prices and its impact on affordability. But of course, home price appreciation is not occurring in a vacuum. Inflation in the Biden economy is broad-based and severe. And despite promises to the contrary from the president and his advisors, inflation fueled by reckless spending and lax monetary policy has been an enduring phenomenon. Adjusted for inflation, wages have fallen almost every month since President Biden took office. The average American real wages have fallen by 5%. It's been even worse for blue-collar workers. So it should come as no surprise that homeownership, like most goods and services, have become increasingly unaffordable. And with respect to home housing specifically, demand far outpaces supply in many, many regions. Why is this happening? And why isn't the housing market naturally correcting these imbalances? I'd point to some bad policy decisions, especially those made by this administration and some of my Democratic colleagues. During COVID, the federal government made a number of mistakes. $80 billion went to rental assistance, vouchers, and other housing subsidies, and that's $80 billion above and beyond the hundreds of billions in ordinary housing subsidies we spend every year, and a significant sum of that remains still unspent. The administration and Democrats in Congress dropped hundreds of billions of dollars, essentially helicopter money, to stimulate an already strong economy. They also unnecessarily extended and expanded foreclosure and eviction moratoria. Outside of the COVID emergency, the number and cost of housing subsidies boggles the mind. We provide tax breaks such as the mortgage interest and PMI deductions, capital gains exclusions on home sales, tax deduction on local property taxes, low-income housing tax credit. We subsidize mortgages with GSE security guarantees, FHA, VA, and USDA mortgage insurance, and Ginnie Mae MBS guarantees, down payment assistance programs. We have an overlapping array of HUD and USDA programs, including project-based rental assistance, tenant-based rental assistance, public housing funding, Section 202 housing for the elderly, Section 811 housing for persons with disabilities, Section 521 rural rental housing, CDBG, home block grant, homelessness assistance. It's unbelievable. And it's a fact that the vast majority of the massive government support in housing subsidizes demand rather than supply. And even more amazingly, all this spending hasn't meaningfully changed homeownership rates over the decades, nor narrowed the racial homeownership gap. In 1970, 52 years ago, the homeownership rate in America was 64%. Today, hundreds of billions, maybe trillions of dollars later, it's 65%. And black home ownership levels are almost the same as when the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. These government policies have run up a lot of debt, but they've mostly just made housing more expensive. If the administration were serious about immediately lowering housing costs, it could start by removing misguided trade barriers that drive up the cost of home construction. It could lift tariffs on lumber, steel, and aluminum, materials that are universally used in home construction across the country and which have cost consumers billions. In the last 3 years, American consumers paid at least $14 billion more just on steel and aluminum imports because of the tariffs. We know lumber tariffs have contributed to price increases too. Unfortunately, the administration is continuing to promote a reckless spending agenda that'll make soaring housing costs even worse. In May, the White House released a plan to supposedly boost housing supply, but instead used the opportunity to add upward pressure on pricing by endorsing a partisan House-passed proposal to increase spending by $75 billion on housing vouchers and $80 billion on public housing. Additional spending of this kind is only going to further fuel inflation. The White House plan also proposed pushing Fannie and Freddie into activities that prior administrations understood created too much risk for taxpayers. In a break from decades of bipartisan efforts to reform the GSEs, the White House has now embraced the GSE conservatorship as a means for social engineering of its housing and racial equity policies. The FHFA recently relaxed restrictions on the GSE's risk layering and acquisitions of investor and second home loans. It reduced the GSE's guarantee fees, and it required the GSEs to develop equitable housing finance. Stunningly, the GSE's new proposed pilot programs limit eligibility based on borrowers' race, and even go so far as to give taxpayer money to certain borrowers based on the color of their skin to make down payments. Yesterday, all banking Republicans sent a letter organized by Senator Tillis to FHFA expressing grave concerns about the legality and the discriminatory nature of these new programs. I hope the FHFA director will reconsider this discrimination on the basis of race and instead act to protect taxpayers from excessive risk as conservativeship envisions. Racial discrimination is always wrong, and this is no exception. Further, relaxing underwriting requirements to chase political priorities risks exposing low-income families, in this case minority families, to wealth loss. The state of the housing market only affirms the urgency of GSE reforms. To improve housing affordability for both renters and owners, we should favor policies that leverage the power of free enterprise. We should phase out demand-side subsidies like down payment assistance and focus FHA on a narrow subset of borrowers. We should end the GSE conservatorship to ensure that this and future administrations cannot use conservatorship to influence the pricing and allocation of mortgage credit. For decades, we've spent countless sums, and we've got virtually nothing to show for it. It's time for meaningful reform that doesn't feature the same tax and spend strategies of the past. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.